I'm Terry Lucas, I'm your library director. I think I recognize a lot of faces out here. I want to thank you for coming tonight. I want to apologize for a bit of a mess. All of these things back here will be going to the school. They're redoing their library, so we're giving that whole pile of stuff back there to the school. So it's not just, it's not going to be tossed away, it's going to be used. Everybody up there on Zoom, welcome, but I'm going to ask you if you would please make sure that you mute yourself during this program unless you're opening up for a question. That helps everybody to hear both at home and here in the room. So this is, believe it or not, our 9th year of the Great Decisions program. And due to all the craziness with the construction, we're going to only have this one very special Great Decisions program. So I want to thank Kirk Ressler, who has done this for 9 years. He's a retired foreign service officer. And he has arranged and worked with us to make sure we have these amazing speakers. So I'm going to let Kirk come and talk to you a little bit and introduce our special guest tonight. Thank you.
So I won't say much because we have a guest who knows the area much better than I. But so we have the honor of having with us tonight Peter Pettibone, who's been a resident here in the Heights for what, 50 years, right, Peter?
You say 43.
43? That's not bad. I've been 42, I think. 42. But anyway, so it's and Peter was a. Besides doing other things, worked in Russia for 20 years, from 1991 to roughly 2010. And he's done these things on virtually an annual basis, I think, Peter, for 3 or 4
Third annual.
This is the third annual? Yep. Okay. So this is really an update, and it's going to be about Ukraine and NATO. And just a word to start from the U.S. government's point of view. Well, I used to work for the State Department, for those of you who don't know. And from the U.S. government's point of view, actually we are kind of pleased at the level of support that we're getting out of Europe. You know, they've had these parliamentary elections there lately for the European Parliament. There's been a turn to the right. But even the right wing in Europe has been pretty supportive of aid to Ukraine. For instance, they just have a new right-wing government in the Netherlands. They're supportive. The National Rally, Marine Le Pen in France, is supportive aid to Ukraine. Maybe not at quite the level of Macron, but still at a high level. Prime Minister Meloni in Italy, whose party has fascist right-wing roots, they're supportive aid to Ukraine. So the aid from Europe is fairly strong. And it's about the same level as the U.S. aid. We may have gone ahead with the latest package that we approved in Washington, but they're right up there. And NATO is obviously as strong as it's ever been, with the new members and the increased spending. I think something like more than half the members of NATO are now spending the 2%, which Donald Trump talks about. So on that end, we're pleased. On the other hand, this most recent visit of Putin to North Korea is very worrying because it opens up the geographic extension of this war. I mean, the North Koreans were already providing artillery shells, but in this agreement they have, that if there is aggression against one country or the others will support it. Not only with artillery shells, but North Korea has one of the largest standing armies in the world. So you could see North Koreans fighting in Russia if they needed it. And then the aid coming the other way, which is going to boost North Korea's offensive abilities with respect to Asia, cause problems, especially for the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, and maybe even for us, depending upon how much technology the Russians transfer to North Korea. So we're happy with the current stance of support, but we're very worried about where this thing is going. And with that context, Peter, I will turn it over to you to fill in all the blanks and answer all the questions.
Peter, if you could use the mic,
Yes,
because we do have a pretty big...
Is it better to, let's see, can you hear me through the mic better? All right,
Yeah.
I'll use this, and I think it may be good also for the folks on Zoom. This is obviously a huge topic, so I thought just 4 areas. What's happened on the battlefield, just in summary form, the technology developments that have taken place, which are really remarkable, the geopolitical changes during the war, that some of which Kirk alluded to, and then finally the big question, does the war continue? So, this is the third annual, as Kirk mentioned. A lot has changed, and a lot has remained static. Just briefly, the war began in February 24, 2022, and it really was not expected by many, including an astute observer as Dmitry Simes, who advised the Kremlin, and later he then was an advisor to the White House. And even he...
Could you hold the mic closer?
Sure. Even Dmitry Simes was surprised that the invasion occurred. I personally thought it wouldn't take place because it was such a disastrous result for both Ukraine and for Russia, and I thought that things would be worked out diplomatically, but no. On February 24, 2022, the Russian troops went across the border, full scale, with a huge invasion. But because of the corruption in the Russian army, it really was not the army that many people thought it was, and it faltered. You may recall that there was a line of tanks and other equipment about 40 miles long on a single road. I mean, obviously a huge target. The rapid advance was quickly stopped, and I think one of the big factors was Burns, now head of the CIA, a former American ambassador to Russia, gave to Zelensky. He also talked with Patrushev, who is the godfather to Putin, so to speak, and said, don't do it. And of course, they did it. But what he did, he advised Zelensky to make sure that Ukraine controlled a very important airport just north of Kiev. If that airport had fallen, I think Kiev would have fallen. It would have been the end of the invasion, and it would be a totally different situation. But it held. And as you know, the Ukrainians were able to push back the Russians quite significantly. Now let's have that map of the war zone. This is the war zone as it currently exists. And you can see it's a very, very long, 600 or 800 miles in length, and it has frankly been roughly static for the last 2 years. And it's been static because it's a situation, I describe it as World War I trench warfare with 21st century abilities, technology, and the like. So it's a very strange thing, but if you ever saw the movie 1917 about trench warfare, that's exactly what's going on in this whole area, starting up in the area of Lugansk and Donetsk and going down to Zaporozhye and Kherson. It is a huge battlefield, and it has remained static. There were early negotiations that might have ended this several months after it began. But when the atrocities that the Russians committed at Bucha became evident, all negotiations were off the table. And so we've had basically a static line, but very, very ferocious fighting. You may recall that there was supposed to be a Ukrainian offensive last year. That offensive started and didn't get anywhere. And that's because the Russians built a huge defensive line along the 600-mile border that basically brought an end to that counteroffensive. You will also remember Yevgeny Prigozhin. He was the so-called cook to Putin, a very close advisor to Putin. He headed the Wagner Group, which was sort of a paramilitary group that fought alongside the Russian army. He obviously did not like the senior generals, Gerasimov or Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and he began a mutiny. And he started in the south, in Rostov-on-the-Don, and moved up towards Moscow, got very close to Moscow, but somehow stopped. Apparently there were negotiations that involved Lukashenko, the head of Belarus, and he stopped, and that was the end of at least the advance. And he thought everything would be fine, but as you know, in August of last year, his plane flying internally in Russia blew up. And not only Prigozhin, but other senior leaders of the Wagner Group. I like to call it the night of the long knives, because it's clear that the Russians did not tolerate Prigozhin and Prigozhin's actions. But basically, it has stayed essentially stagnant this way. On the other hand, the Russian economy has changed dramatically. It is now a war economy. About 40% of Russia's GDP is devoted to the military. And of course, we all are aware of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, individuals, companies, and all the restrictions that are taking place. Nevertheless, I understand from friends who are living in Moscow that life goes on, that all the restaurants are full, the theaters are full, and part of the reason for that is that the conscripts come from poorer areas, and they're paid a great deal of money, whether they serve, whether they're wounded or they die. They're paid a great deal of money, so there's an incentive for Russians living in places like Buryatia, Chechnya, and elsewhere to fight. But the younger people living in St. Petersburg and in Moscow have largely avoided that, and there has not been a draft. There's talk about a draft called a mobilization, but it has not happened. However, the casualties are horrific, absolutely horrific. On the Russian side, we think that there have been about 500,000 killed or seriously wounded, and on the Ukrainian side, 200 to 300,000. And these are rough figures because both sides are keeping the statistics on casualties very low. But it's an amazing amount, and the war continues. And I think that as of right now, I would say the prospect is for a continuation of the war. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Let's turn to the technology. Do you want to put up that slide? The original.
Sure.
You may recall that during World War II, the Enigma was the machine that the Nazis had that coded all of the communications, particularly for the submarines. And there was an intensive effort to break the codes. Bletchley Park, you probably read the stories about Bletchley Park. And Alan Turing developed the very first computer, and that was really, in a sense, out of the war situation. And similarly with radar. Radar was used to guide aircraft under stormy conditions and the like so that they could continue their missions. So these were two classic examples of technology developed during a wartime situation. In this case, we are all very familiar with Elon Musk's Starlink system, the satellite system for communications. And that has been used by the Ukrainian army. And the interesting thing is that that has allowed for a devolution of decision-making from the highest levels down to the company levels. So sergeants, captains, lieutenants, and all that can make decisions because they can communicate with headquarters, which is something that, frankly, the Russian side does not use, does not do. The Russians are still operating under the old Soviet doctrine of everything starts from the top, and the soldiers are there just to fight. The soldiers are not there to make any sort of tactical decisions. They're there just to follow orders. But as a result, the Ukrainian army is quite agile, and even though it's much smaller than the Russian army, it has succeeded because of this use of the Starlink system. And of course, we all know about drones. We probably heard about drones before February 2022, but we certainly heard a great deal about drones since then. Drones have been used by both the Ukrainian and the Russian side, among other things, to have battlefield surveillance. And I understand that the soldiers are very unwilling to get out of the trenches, as they did in the movie 1917 in World War I, because they can be spotted immediately, and then they are then a target. But the drones have radically changed warfare, and particularly in the maritime situation. Ukraine does not have a navy, yet Ukraine has managed to push the Black Sea Fleet of Russia from its headquarters in Sevastopol on the Crimea Peninsula all the way to the the eastern end of the Black Sea, to Novorossiysk. And it's done that because it has, with technology, it has created very small kamikaze boats, low freeboard, loaded with TNT and other munitions, and guided by AI, guided by communications, and they have been able to go even 600 or 700 miles and have attacked the Russian Navy, and as I say, caused the Russian Navy to cease being in Sevastopol, moved it all the way to the eastern shore of the Black Sea, and indeed even to the Sea of Azov and to the Caspian. That is a remarkable thing. And of course, on the Russian side, they have begun using what are called glide bombs. These are bombs, some of them huge, 1,000-pound bombs, and they outfit these bombs with ailerons and wings and rudders, and they are launched from aircraft that fly in Russian airspace. The aircraft do not fly into Ukraine. They fly in Russian airspace, and then they shoot the bombs off, and they are, again, through technology, glided to their particular targets. Now, the targets have been as far away as Kiev, Kharkiv, possibly Odessa, but it's very interesting that this technology is being used on both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. Of course, we are also, the Pentagon, the British military, the French, the German, have been watching very carefully. In our case, we are obviously deploying the Patriot missile defense system, which is perhaps the most sophisticated missile defense system, and we're testing it. It's being tested under actual combat conditions. So I assume that it and other materiel that we are providing to the Ukrainians is being tested and looked at very, very carefully. So that is it on technology. But I would like to go to the third point, which are the geopolitical changes during the war. Kirk alluded to the fact that NATO has been invigorated or reinvigorated. You may recall that around the time of the seizure of Crimea by the Russians, there was absolutely nothing that was done. There were commentators, I think even Macron said that, what is the purpose of NATO? Well, the NATO purpose has been certainly gelled with what's going on. NATO has expanded to include Finland and Sweden. Many of the countries are now paying in their 2% of GDP for defense. It is a very strong alliance. As you know, it's headed by an American, in this case, Chris Cavoli, a Princeton graduate. And it is now a very powerful force. And I do not hear people saying at this point, what's the purpose of NATO? Why should NATO exist? I think NATO is in a very strong position. The question, though, is the overriding question has been how can this technology be used? And so in the geopolitical sense, we have said that our equipment should not be used inside of Russia. We are very concerned about an escalation. We're very concerned about the involvement of NATO forces. So in the geopolitical sense, we have put limits on the ability to use our technology and our equipment. It is, however, a line that seems to be moving a bit. At the present time, the issue is whether we will allow our very sophisticated HIMARS artillery, which can go shoot apparently close to 200 miles, whether we would allow that to be used to attack targets inside Russia, as, for example, the airfields or the aircraft that are used to send the glide bombs into Ukraine. And at the present time, we are still very concerned about the use of American or NATO equipment outside of Ukraine. We will allow it to be used in Ukraine, but not outside of Ukraine. But that is an issue. Is that a red line that is going to, in effect, no longer be a red line? I think at the moment it is a strong red line. Another aspect, of course, has been the freezing of Russian assets. There's about $300 billion of Russian central bank money that is held in Europe and the United States. The bulk of it is held in Brussels in an outfit called Euroclear. There have been many discussions about the use of those assets. At the present time, and I think the G7 just a few weeks ago approved a plan under which the interest earned on the $300 billion would be used to secure a loan of around $50 billion to Ukraine and it's very unsure what the purpose of the loan, whether it's to buy more military equipment or whether it's to reconstruct Ukraine. That's something I think that needs to be clarified. So the geopolitical situation has changed quite a bit. I have thought of, can we put the world map up? Because I want to show something on that. I have thought that there is an interesting development going on, and I sort of refer to it as the axis of convenience, and that is the four countries that seem to be on the other side, which are, of course, Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran, that they are not in any formal agreement, but they are all very concerned about what they call U.S. hegemony. They're very much opposed to U.S. hegemony, and of course they are supplying Russia with the means to carry out the war in Ukraine. Obviously, as Kirk mentioned, a great deal of artillery has come from North Korea, and the drones and drone technology has come from Iran. China, at the present time, as far as we know, is not supplying any materiel to Russia, but it certainly is supplying support in the sense of purchasing oil at a discounted rate. Both China and India have provided a great deal of funding for the Russian war effort through the purchases of oil. But I think if you look at it this way, to some extent, they might be viewing themselves as being surrounded, because each of them, Iran, obviously NATO, and South Korea, are surrounding China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. So I mean, it's an interesting thing. If you think of it, it's somewhat of a contiguous situation. It is not yet an alliance. It is not yet anything more than that. There's no coordination, but it is certainly an axis of convenience in the sense that it is helping Russia fund this war. And we all know, of course, of these other associations, the Quad, which is made up of the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, is in a sense an organization that might be viewed as its purpose is to provide information and security against China, but it is also one that obviously is very concerned about the war. On the other hand, on the other side, you have the BRICS, which are Brazil, India, China, South Africa, and they are, in a sense, more aligned with Russia than they are with the Western countries. But we have a situation where there are these alliances, or not even alliances, the groupings that are out there that are beginning to gel into something. And I think if the war continues, we will see more coordination, at least on the side of this axis of convenience of China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. A very troubling thing. Can we turn to the main thing? Because okay, this is the area that I think we want to spend time on, which is, does the war continue? As I mentioned, the casualties are horrific. We're approaching 750,000 people. By contrast, if you think of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, over a 10-year period, about 50,000 were killed or seriously wounded. If you think of our experience in Vietnam, it was in the magnitude of 50,000, 50 to 60,000. Here we're talking about 700 to 800,000 now, and of course if the war continues, that figure could reach 1 million. I mean, it is a huge number, but the risks are greater involvement of NATO. Right now, NATO troops are training the Ukrainians. There are, to my knowledge, no combat troops as such in Ukraine from any of the NATO countries. But will that continue that way? It's very hard to say. And of course, there's always the great risk of thermonuclear war in the sense of tactical nuclear weapons. Russia has the largest supply of tactical nuclear weapons of any country. And you probably know that between the United States and Russia, the two countries control 90% of all atomic weapons, which is a huge number. However, bear in mind also that the 4 countries that I mentioned in this axis of convenience are all nuclear or about to be nuclear. Clearly, North Korea has nuclear capabilities. China certainly does. About Iran, well, you know, many people think that Iran is just 10 days away from developing a nuclear weapon. And of course, Russia is definitely a nuclear country. So you've got, in this axis of convenience, nuclear capabilities. And while I think that there are many reasons why that no one really wants to break the taboo, the 80-year taboo against the use of nuclear weapons, 1945 to today, that taboo is tenuous. And I think that if there were NATO troops involved in fighting Russians on Russian soil, that we might very well see the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And by the way, a tactical nuclear weapon is not a small thing. A tactical nuclear weapon is huge, and you can get casualties in the tens of thousands with these very small tactical nuclear weapons. I am hoping that China puts a damper on this. It's hard to say. I mean, China is part of this axis of convenience, but I think that China is very much wedded to developing its economy. It's wedded to trade with Europe. A disruption of the use of tactical nuclear weapons would certainly set everything back tremendously. So I'm hoping that if this war continues, as I suspect it will, that there'll be pressure against Russia using tactical nuclear weapons. So those are the risks. Now, what about the maximalist positions of the parties, of the two sides? What does Ukraine want? What does Russia want? Well, Ukraine would like to have its 1991 territories, which would include all of Crimea, as well as, we go back to that first battle, as well as, you can see that the line is inside of Ukraine, but fairly close to the eastern border of Ukraine, but that all the Russian troops exit these areas. And of course, it would like to have reparations and money to fund reconstruction. As you know from reading the paper, Ukraine has been heavily damaged, just heavily damaged. And not only in cities like Mariupol and the like down near the war zone, but also areas outside of it. Kiev has suffered a great deal of damage. Kharkiv has suffered a great deal of damage. So who is going to pay for it? Well, I mentioned the possibility of a loan, of a $50 billion loan, but again, I'm not sure what the usage it will be, whether it's to buy more weapons or reconstruct. It's going to need a great deal more than $50 billion to reconstruct. So part of Zelensky's interest in his maximalist positions is to have funding that will help reconstruct over a long period of time, but reconstruct the area. And that those reparations come from Russia. So that's the position on the Ukrainian side. On the Russian side, what Russia would like to do is to have incorporate, well, it's already technically incorporated 4 regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk, into Russia. They are now, well, from a legal standpoint, part of Russia. Of course, nobody recognizes it, but that's what they've done. Putin would like to have those 4 regions recognized as being part of the Russian Federation. Putin would also like to have all of Ukraine be neutral, not join either the EU or NATO. And of course, he would like to have all that frozen assets, the $300 billion that's in Brussels in the United States, unfrozen, and the sanctions removed. These are completely opposite positions. I mean, you can't reconcile the Ukrainian demands with the Russian demands. So does that mean that the war will never end? No, wars do end. Wars do come to an end, and this war will come to an end at some point in time. And I hope that it will end before we get into the risky area that I mentioned, which would involve NATO troops, or which would involve, God help us, tactical nuclear weapons. There are some signs that some movement can take place. I think one of the things, at least this is all speculation on my part, there's absolutely nothing more than just thoughts in my head, but that Zelensky is worried that if Trump becomes president, all aid from the United States is cut off, or substantially cut off. And I think he feels that perhaps Trump would dictate the terms of a sort of ceasefire. He would rather do it himself. So for that reason alone, Zelensky has given some indication, meeting with Viktor Orban and the like, that maybe there's some movement on that side. And when you think about it, the area of Crimea down here, which was taken over by Russia in 2014, has historically been Russian. The czars, the last 2 czars, Alexander III and Nicholas II, built their palaces there. Chekhov had a house in the middle of Yalta. There are, and I think that in the 10 years that have elapsed from the takeover of Crimea by the Russians in 2014 and today, it has been completely repopulated with Russians. I think if you were to go there, you would not find any Ukrainians. So that if that were to be, in effect, returned to Ukraine, there would be quite a bit of, shall we say, relocation of people. It may be that there could be some situation in which the regions of Kherson and Zaporozhye, in effect, go back to Ukraine, but that Donetsk and Luhansk, which had a very large Russian population, Russian-speaking population before 2022, might well be allowed to be incorporated into Russia. I mean, these are just speculations, but there are ways in which things can move. There is the $50 billion loan that's at least on the drawing boards. That could be increased for reconstruction. There could be some negotiations then beginning after a ceasefire that would allow the two parties, Ukraine and Russia, to work out some sort of settlement. It's somewhat of a pipe dream, but it is something that would, I think, bring to an end this horrific war. As I say, the casualties approach 750,000, and the risks of escalation are certainly there. Not an easy thing to talk about, not an easy solution, but there are no easy solutions in this. And I guess that's basically all I can say about this situation. It's with us. It makes the newspapers every day, and it, at the moment, is insoluble unless the parties see an advantage to both of them. Oh, I should say from Putin's side, why would Putin do this? Well, Putin has been isolated. As you know, he's deemed to be a war criminal. The International Criminal Court has called him that, and he can't travel really outside. He can only travel to certain countries, the risk that he might be apprehended. I also think that Putin is very much aware that he has not won the war. Certainly he did not win the war as he thought he would win it in February of 2022. As you see from the map, the only area controlled, so to speak, in addition to Crimea, is the easternmost part on the eastern side of the front line. And he recognizes that is the case. He also is beginning to lose out to his very friendly China. They had what was called a no-limits partnership, and I have been reading recently that the term no limits is no longer being used, or not being used as much. China, with its very long perspective and its Belt and Road Initiative, is taking steps that I think if Russia were stronger, if it were not so preoccupied with the war in Ukraine, it might say to Xi, Putin might say to Xi, let's hold off from doing this. But among other things, there's a new rail line that's been projected to be built from China through Central Asia, bypassing the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the BAM, the Baikal-Amur main line. And it will get Chinese product to Europe much more quickly, much less expensively. But obviously, it's a real affront to Russia. Russia's also losing influence in the stands in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. They're beginning to look a little bit more towards China. And this has to hurt in a way. I mean, his idea of rebuilding the Great Russia, not necessarily the Soviet Union, but the Great Russia, is diminishing day by day. He is no longer being listened to. He abandoned Armenia in this fight with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think that Putin probably is saying, no, wait a minute, if I spend all of my efforts on Ukraine, I'm going to lose more and more. And that may induce him over time to, and hopefully not over time, but fairly soon, to agree to some sort of ceasefire. I think what has to happen first is a ceasefire. And this is the Korean solution. You may recall that in 1953, the war ended. There has been no treaty between North and South Korea. It's where the fighting stopped. And obviously, the two countries are hostile to each other, but other than some skirmishes, there's been no resumption of the war. Now, in that case, we have 30,000 U.S. troops stationed in Korea. That is protection against this happening. I think that if there were a ceasefire, we would then have to have some force, a Western force in Ukraine as a prevention. I mean, we do not want to do this before there's a ceasefire. There has to be a ceasefire, a stoppage of all this killing and bombing and all, but then perhaps some sort of security force within Ukraine, just like the 30,000 U.S. troops in South Korea, to prevent a resumption of hostility. But then I think if that happens, then we can talk about things like swapping of some territory and perhaps, and certainly exchanges of prisoners, etc. And I think that would certainly put behind us this great fear of having NATO troops fighting Russians or the use of tactical nuclear weapons. So that is just a thought, as I say, it's strictly my own personal feeling, but I think it can happen because I think that Zelensky realizes that if Trump is president, he's going to lose out greatly, and he wants to stay in control. And he wants to have the ability to negotiate, not to be forced by the United States to certain positions that he might not want. And Putin, on the other hand, realizes that he's now really quite isolated. He's lost a lot of influence, and that maybe if Ukraine can be settled, not necessarily in a nice way, but settled, that he can then focus his attention on other parts of the world. So, with that happy news, I will entertain questions. Yes, okay.
Was Ukraine considered Russia's breadbasket? I mean, were they?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
pretty much.
It was considered a breadbasket. It was also, unfortunately, during the Soviet period, in effect terrorized by Russia. Within the Soviet Union, there was the great famine that occurred that the Kremlin felt that it should take the product, the grain, and sell it to the West for hard currency, meanwhile starving many Ukrainians. But yes, it's a breadbasket. And now, interestingly, pushing the Black Sea fleet all the way to the eastern shore of the Black Sea has allowed Ukraine now to ship grain to its markets in Africa. So I mean, that is thanks to the great Ukrainian Navy, which doesn't exist. Yes.
I think some people may not be aware that Ukraine was once a great kingdom, but got folded in a long time ago to Russia, only to have Khrushchev, for some internal political reasons and perhaps some family connections, to declare it back to being Ukraine, which is when it broke up, that's where they were.
Yeah.
And that's said some of these things in slow motion.
Yes, the incorporation of Crimea into Ukraine was done by Khrushchev just signing a piece of paper saying that the boundary is now here rather than there.
But if you're Russian, that's a major objective because that bottles you up. You know, they are not a great naval country, but what they have has to get out. And if they can't be based in Crimea, they have no basis to control.
Right. Yes.
This is a very elemental question, but for me, pictures can be worth 1,000 words. And just seeing the scale versus the size of Russia and the size of the U.S., is it fair for me to ask what state in the U.S. does Ukraine fit into in terms of the size?
Oh, it wouldn't. It wouldn't. I mean, even Texas, it wouldn't. No, Ukraine is very large. Ukraine, if you were to superimpose a map of Ukraine on the United States, it would cover most of the United States.
Oh, okay. This just
Most
look
of
like
it's
that on
huge.
the.
It is the largest country in Europe, by far. But it has had a terrible relationship with Russia, not only from February 2022, it goes way back, certainly to the 1930s with this famine that Russia created. How about from Zoom?
Yeah, so the first question we have is, given the potential changing governments in France, the UK, and the US, isn't there a risk that the NATO coalition in support of Ukraine could be seriously in jeopardy?
Well, there is, but I think Kirk mentioned earlier that it seems that the new right-wing governments are still standing up to their NATO commitments. So hopefully that will not happen. I mean, the risk to Europe is that this thing which probably would not happen, that Russia is able to move across Ukraine. That is unlikely. But what is likely is involvement of NATO troops against Russian troops. And that is a very significant step. And I think that even the right-wing governments in France, would be a left wing in England, right? Labour wins. But all those are very much aware that this is a line that we do not want to cross. We do not want to have NATO troops fighting Russian troops, whether in Ukraine or elsewhere. So I think that's a reason why I would say, but Kirk, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that I mentioned before that in France and Italy, the right wing was supportive of aid to Ukraine, and so as Peter, so as you said, so is the Labour Party in the UK, should they win. The big problem, of course, is the presumed Republican nominee for president here in the United States. And Europe is planning on trying to provide additional assistance to replace the United States should Trump pull out. And whether they'll be able to do so or not. But what everybody is finding out, and Peter, you may have a comment on this, is that the defense industrial base is just lacking to be able to produce enough munitions for the Ukrainians. And actually it was lacking in Russia too, which is why they've had to go to North Korea and Iran and other places. Which raises, Peter, let me ask you a question. I mean, are we, with all these blocks forming in the world, and with people thinking about Russian technical assistance to North Korea, I mean, are we kind of sleepwalking into World War III?
I love that phrase. By the way, there's a very good article in the current Foreign Affairs called Sleepwalking to War. It talks about Germany and Britain before World War I, but it also talks about the current situation of China and the United States. Yes, sleepwalking to war is a very, very difficult thing. Could we put up the world map again? The interesting thing, as I say, is that we seem to be having alliances developing. So from China's perspective, looking out eastward, it has China, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand, all there, in effect, against China. Now, obviously, there's no warfare, but there are economic issues. There's probably a lot of cyber warfare going on. But from their perspective, looking out, there is a huge group, maybe not a formal alliance, but there. And of course, from Russia's perspective, it now has Finland and Sweden in NATO, all of NATO, and countering Iran is Saudi Arabia. So from Russia's standpoint, it has on the western side this arc facing it. Will that hold? Will that gel into some sort of formal alliance? I don't know. But it is certainly a potential. Mike?
The political position of Finland and Poland have always been very inimical to Russia. Is that attitude escalating?
No, I don't think so. In fact, one of my friends in Moscow said the other day when we were talking that yes, Finland and Sweden have joined Russia, but that they always considered Finland and Russia really in the Western camp. And in addition, he said that we already have 3 former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, who were part of the Soviet Union. Now they are part of NATO. So I think that other than the psychological aspect, that Finland and Sweden joining NATO hasn't changed the balance. What it has done, though, is it's added a lot more economic power to NATO and a lot of the materiel and the like, so that, as you know, NATO, the treaty, Section 5, is one for all and all for one. So an attack on any NATO member is an attack on all. So the psychological aspect is strong, but I don't think that many of them thought it was going to add a great deal. Sue?
Peter, what position does the Israeli-Hamas conflict put us vis-a-vis the support for the Ukraine? It just seems to me that when after October 7th, at least in the United States, so much of the focus shifted to Israel. And
You're absolutely right. It shifted, and as long
but
as...
is that just the United States, or do you think it's in Europe as well?
I think it's primarily the United States. I do, but it certainly shifted our focus. I mean, that's another reason why perhaps Zelensky will be more amenable to a ceasefire, because realizing that our attention is directed to another conflict and diminishes our ability to handle the war in Ukraine. Another one from, okay, go ahead, yes.
About the language, Ukrainian is spoken, how big an area is Ukrainian spoken?
Go back to the blue one. Okay, this side from Kharkiv through Donetsk, Lugansk, and Zaporozhye, all the way down to Kherson is Russian speaking. And Kiev is essentially half and half. And the Lviv in this area is largely Ukrainian speaking. But I must say that with the war continuing, a lot of Russian speakers have stopped speaking Russian, they're speaking Ukrainian. But it is difficult. Zelensky's principal language is Russian, but he's doing his best to conduct everything in Ukrainian. Bill.
Peter, you mentioned the important American defense systems that as we did with Israel, to help them build and protect your dome.
Yeah.
We seem to be doing the same thing for the Ukrainians. Does that involve American military personnel on the ground there, not with rifles, but with computers and technological things? And is that a future possible problem for us?
I'm not so sure that it is. I mean, we have been very close with the Ukrainian military in the technological area, providing them with all sorts of systems and the like. I think that, and of course, we are training some Ukrainians. But it is an issue. For example, the F-16s, which are coming to Ukraine, the training for that has been done in Western Europe. So we don't have trainers in Ukraine, to my knowledge, training Ukrainian pilots to operate the F-16s, but they are being trained elsewhere. In fact, I think some of them are being trained in Texas.
Yes, but there's a video that shows an F-16 blowing up two Russian tank or something like that right nearby inside of the Ukraine, or what was historically Ukraine.
Right.
So it's happening.
Yeah, well, I think that there's no question but that we're using, our equipment is being used to fight Russia inside Ukraine, but it's being operated by Ukrainian soldiers, not by US soldiers. So the training is an interesting issue. I mean, if a trainer is training Ukrainian soldiers to use a new system and is doing that inside Ukraine, is that crossing a red line? It's blurring it at the best.
Peter, can I?
Yeah.
Yes. You know, when Iran attacked Israel, the United States participated in the defense of Israel when they shot the 300 missiles over about 2 to 3 weeks ago. And it was a combination of U.S., other allies, perhaps the Brits, and the Israelis shooting down those missiles before they arrived in Israel. Could we not do the same thing in Ukraine? Could we not use American carriers and missiles offshore, not in Ukraine? And then to attack, then to blow up Russian missiles as they're coming into Ukraine?
And after they come into Ukraine?
Yeah.
Well, in effect, that's what's being done now. It's just where the line is, and what Zelensky very much would like is the ability to use American equipment, particularly the HIMARS, the 200-mile rockets, to go into Russia and attack the aircraft that are about to fly and to eject these glide bombs back into Ukraine. That's what they would like. And that would be involving U.S. equipment in an offensive way inside of Russia. So that is not today allowed. Now, the Ukrainians are doing a lot in Russia. In fact, they've even had drone bombs in Moscow. They apparently disrupted the Baikal-Amur mainline railroad, blowing up a car inside a tunnel, which obviously significantly impacted the transportation of men and material to Ukraine. And also, they have attacked the Kerch Bridge. The Kerch Bridge is a very interesting bridge. After Russia, Putin, seized Crimea, they built a bridge, a very long bridge. It's a rail and a car bridge across the Kerch Straits. And I actually saw, when I was in Moscow, a video with Putin on the train, the inaugural train going from the Russian side into Odessa. They're very proud of it, and it's been attacked twice. The first was with a car bomb, or truck bomb, that blew up and damaged it. And the second was one of these kamikaze drones that went in and attacked it. So that bridge, which was a major supply route for men and material, Russian men and material to go to Ukraine, is now heavily damaged. But this was the pride of Putin, this particular bridge. And of course, it's thanks to technology, it may exist, but it's certainly not being used the way it was intended.
Yeah, Peter, we have some reports that say that Russia has a lot of problem recruiting military people. So there are reports.
Recruiting them where?
In the military.
Yeah.
Right? So they are actually getting people from Nepal and sort of Nepal and other. Similarly, I think Ukrainian also, the reports that you've seen in the past, in the New York Times, that they are having difficulty recruiting people in the military. Would that sort of from both sides, because you need people to fight with all the technology and all the missiles and everything else. But without human resources, I think you cannot continue the war. Would that have any impact in terms of what you were talking about, trying to find a solution?
I think relatively little impact. I think the major issue is whether it's American soldiers fighting Russian soldiers or NATO soldiers fighting Russian soldiers. So if there are Nepalese or others, I think that it probably would not have a significant impact. But you raise the most interesting point, which is the disparity in the size of the populations between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine's population is around 38 million. Russia today is around 144. And so it's almost 5 times the size population-wise. And the real issue for Ukraine is it's running out of people. It doesn't have people who want to fight. You probably read a number of articles in the press where men of the draft age, or the conscription age, are hiding from the military, people who want to draft them. So it's a very difficult thing. And that is may well be a limiting factor on whether this war can continue. No more people to fight. Well, listen, oh yes, what, Joan?
The ceasefire, the Ukrainians at a great disadvantage for a negotiation of a ceasefire with Russia if they're running out of military?
It's a good question. I think that we do need to end this war. I mean, the horrific casualties and all the risks that are there. It will not be a nice ceasefire. It'll be a messy ceasefire. But I think that if it stops, if I understand the question, if it stops, I don't think it really affects things. One of the things that it would enable, I believe, is that perhaps a more accelerated route for Ukraine to join the EU. I think the possibility of the Ukraine joining NATO is very, very far in the future. I just don't see that happening. But I do see that it might well, once there's a ceasefire, be able to join the EU. And as I say, there should be some sort of stabilizing force, military force in Ukraine after the ceasefire takes effect. It would prevent it from the war reopening. Now, about the war reopening, Russia has lost a great deal of equipment. I have some statistics here. It's lost 8,000 tanks, 15,000 armored fighting vehicles, etc., helicopters, airplanes, even one submarine. So the thought that Russia could then turn around and start up again, or indeed try to invade Europe, is way out of the cards. I think that the likely scenario is, if this thing doesn't end, is that it will just continue to grind on, and that figure of 750,000 will become 1 million, and the other risks that I mentioned.
So what would
Robin?
be the earliest time that you might anticipate a ceasefire?
Robin, you want a question?
Actually, I have just 2 thoughts. One may be very old news, but when you just said that the Ukraine might be able to join the EU, someone, I can't remember who, a couple of years ago said that Russia's fear is that Ukraine joins the EU. It could demonstrate to the Russian population what a successful economy looks like. I can't remember, it could have been our Bulgarian in-law, I'm not sure. But it was sort of a stunning remark at the time, but it may be very old news.
Yeah, I don't think that really would carry too much water because I think that obviously Russia is very much aware of the developments in the other former Soviet republics. And I think that if Ukraine joins the EU, it will take a long time to really benefit from it. After all, the major issue is going to be the reconstruction of Ukraine. Ukraine has been really devastated, and it continues to be devastated every day that goes on. Bombs are dropped in all parts of Ukraine. But I do think that many of the Russians realize that they have severed a fraternal relationship that they had with Ukraine. Many of my friends in Moscow had relatives in Ukraine. My office manager, her parents lived in Odessa. And so many people had parents, children, relatives in the two countries. And unfortunately, what this war has done is it really created an impenetrable barrier, as I see it, for relations to occur. And if there is a ceasefire, it will be a long time before there's much commerce between the West and Russia. A lot of so-called bridges have been burned. And write-offs by American companies when they left Russia were very, very large. I think that it will take many, many years before things to settle down. But one thought I had when I was putting this together is that you may remember that during the Cold War, Vienna was the place where the East and the West met, all the espionage, the third man and all that. Now it's Dubai. Dubai is the place where Russians and Americans, East and West meet. So Dubai is the new Vienna insofar as this new relationship between the axis of convenience and the West takes place. I'll take one more question.
What is the holdup in NATO not accepting Ukraine?
First of all, NATO does not accept a member that's in combat. Just, that's an absolute rule.
But even before the...
Well, there was and may still be a lot of concern about corruption, about their standards, etc. I mean, I thought for a long while that Ukraine's and Georgia's attempts to join NATO were just far-fetched. And there's no way that the NATO, by the way, admission to NATO requires unanimous consent of the members. And there's no way that the members are going to let Ukraine into NATO now. I mean, maybe 10 years from now. But the EU is a different situation. I think there's a very good chance that if a ceasefire takes place, that admission to the EU can be fast-tracked. Yes?
In a related vein, do you give any credence to the argument that the expansion of NATO constituted a security threat to Russia from its point of view?
Well, I don't think it was a security threat, but I think that psychologically, Putin and his cohorts kept seeing the boundaries moving closer and closer to Russia. After all, remember that there are three NATO members that are contiguous to Russia, that is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, so that there were NATO countries on its border, but I think psychologically having it move to other parts of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, was a psychological effect. But from a security point of view, I don't think that we presented the threat. I mean, a large part of the reason that Russia invaded Ukraine dealt with Putin's view of the world, his view of Ukraine not being a real country, and so forth. Things that I think we all think were spurious, but nevertheless motivated him to attack. Robin, one question?
Sorry, yes, my second point was not such old news, but maybe, I think Putin made a big mistake with the alliance with North Korea, because when we're talking about sleepwalking into World War III, the last thing that the Chinese want is Russia in North Korea. The South Korea doesn't want it, the Japanese don't want it, it's where all the war started, right, from the late 1800s on. So I haven't followed because there's been a lot of domestic news, but I just wonder what's going on behind the scenes, US, China.
That's the subject of another great decisions meeting. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming.